it is definitely a part of my lineage to feel a bit displaced and ungrounded and to kind of like just be dabbling and floating among communities and groups without ever feeling like I quote unquote belonged. And now it's like I don't necessarily feel I belong anywhere, but instead of feeling like that's a hurdle to overcome, now I just kind of really understand that the concept of belonging really can't be tied to anything outside of me. And so now the work is really just thinking about like, what does belonging even fucking mean at this point in its true
Wow.
form, not like the socialized
Yeah.
form.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you like what we do and want to make a contribution, you can become a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. Now, join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman, and my pronouns are she and they. In this episode, I have a conversation with Anne Hodder-Shipp, a sex and relationship educator who works with queer and trans teenagers. Anne's pronouns are she and they, and she is a queer femme. They're also neurodivergent with a recent ADHD diagnosis. She doesn't have language that totally feels right, but says that sometimes agender, nonbinary, and demigirl work. Find out what that means to Anne in this episode. We also talk about not having a sense of belonging, feeling safe in your skin, self-soothing and meeting yourself where you're at, upholding meaning over language at all cost, how the gender binary is weaponised, that a new awareness of reality is often accompanied by a mourning process, looking at love languages through a different lens, and reframing the concepts of love, touch, and relationships. To clarify some terminology that is used in the episode, AFAB is assigned female at birth. It was recorded on the 20th of April 2022. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
My name is Anne Hodder-Shipp.
Hello, Anne.
Hi.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about gender. Let's dive straight in. So the words you used in your email was queer femme. What does that mean to you? I really love that term because I use the word queer for myself, and the term femme is something I've been, trying on for size, I suppose. So what does that all mean to you?
Let's see. So, queer it kind of means a couple different things, but I just kind of like that it's a bit of an umbrella term that just kind of shows like maybe there isn't a particular tie to a certain identifier, but that there is sort of an emotional and maybe intellectual and certainly like relational divergence from norms. And so, and especially because that word, when I was in middle school and high school, it was used very specifically as a major put down. And so I just kind of love the idea of not only having a word that that actually like makes me feel a little bit like, at home when I use it. It also has a little bit of like a fuck you to the time when that word
Totally.
could, cause, you know, could lead to violence or losing your job or, being
Yeah.
ostracized from family and community. And so I like that about that word.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess femme for me, so many people in my community would use it to describe themselves. And then some of them had actually used it to describe me just in passing. And I like that it's more of a descriptor than a word that kind of like is supposed to dig deep to your core sense of self and soul and shows that maybe aesthetically or I don't know, emotionally or something is connected to, the concept of femininity, but not sort of tied to everything that is associated with the concept of femininity, because ultimately there really is a core construct related to like, white European ideals of how women are supposed to like look and feel and express and all the things. So
Yeah.
I like that it kind of is embracing femininity while also saying fuck you to, patriarchy and white supremacy culture.
Yep.
And then there's also an element of like rejecting the idea of femme erasure and that being femme or feminine is somehow too normy. And so it just has like a lot of symbolism behind it. And that's really just for me, of course. I have
Yeah.
to imagine other people feel different ways about, why
Mm.
they use that word and why they feel good about it. But those are
Yeah.
why those two words together really feel powerful to me.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. So what's your journey with gender been like? I mean, how long have you been exploring the subject, I suppose? And is it linked to your work, being like a sex and relationship educator?
Well, what's funny is I think I didn't really start to intentionally think about it for myself until 2020, honestly.
Mm.
Before that, I didn't necessarily have a strong tie to anything, but because most of my work has been helping other people and really, especially teenagers, just explore and really just like hold space for all the questions and all of the ideas. And I don't know if I think other sex and relationship educators or therapists might be able to relate because when you are so focused on supporting others and you get to kind of see their journey and it feels very nourishing and rewarding,
Mm.
uh, in your downtime, we're kind of just like, where's the wine? Where's my cat? Let's go see a movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I never really had the need or the opportunity to kind of to sit down to think about what all of this means even for me and to really think
Mm.
about some of the albeit vague and minimal memories I have from childhood just to kind of see how the idea of gender, specifically girlness, has really played an interesting role in my life and in ways that I just didn't really have any reason to think outside of until, I was at home almost exclusively 24 hours a day living in Los Angeles, during a raging pandemic. So when I wasn't just working all of the time, it was really I had opportunity to I didn't have to engage in any of the sort of ritualistic stuff that I didn't hate by any means, but it took a lot of work and energy and really just realizing how much of it, like it's all a performance in a lot of ways, but how much of it was a performance in order to
Mm.
prove to, I don't know, ultimately, I guess myself that I belonged in this club that I had been kind of rejected from and told I wasn't allowed to be a part of since I was very, very tiny. And so when
Mm.
I didn't have any reason to be out in the world and I was just had to be sort of like forced to exist as I was in this little box, literally
Mm.
and figuratively in LA, then it was
Yeah.
like, oh, interesting. What what is that all about? And how are some of these realizations potentially related to what's actually true for me? And now that everything is different in so many ways in life and
Mm.
likely permanently, it was really just kind of like, is this the time to kind of embrace the words and the language and the ideas and the feels that I've always had, but just didn't really connect to anything outside of just being Anne. And
Mm.
so, a tiny, silver lining of that
Mm.
traumatic time I was in Los Angeles. I'm no longer in that city, and I really do recognize now it was traumatic to experience the pandemic where I was,
Mm.
and in the situation that I was in. But it's just really I don't know. I don't even know really how to even like
Mm.
explain it because it's still almost happening in real time, just in different ways.
Yeah,
But
that
it's
makes
just been nice
sense.
to kind of like no longer feel the same kind of like pressure to have to earn language or to have to
Mm.
prove something to be a part of some kind of community and just really recognize that like it is definitely a part of my lineage to feel a bit displaced and ungrounded
Mm.
and to kind of like just be dabbling and floating among communities and groups without ever feeling like I quote unquote belonged. And now it's like I
Mm.
don't necessarily feel I belong anywhere, but instead of feeling like that's a hurdle to overcome, now I just kind of really understand that the concept of belonging really can't be tied to anything outside
Ooh,
of me. And so now the work is really just thinking about like what does belonging even fucking mean at this point in its true
wow.
form, not like the socialized
Yeah.
form.
That is so insightful though, because I think most people, including myself, when we think about belonging, we think about like to something, to a group, to a
Mhm.
tribe, to, something outside of ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. God, that's so interesting. Yeah. So how do you feel? You talked about being neurodivergent and you recently were diagnosed with ADHD. Do you feel like this, how does this link in with like all these facets of your identity and like gender and perhaps belonging as well?
Yeah, I don't know. This is again kind of like in the exploratory phase, but I just think
Mm,
I've always been, I don't know, I've always been different. I've always experienced the world a little differently and engaged with people differently and never
mm,
necessarily felt bad about it. And I think having a sort of diagnostic label to connect to some of the experiences I was having that fall outside of the stereotypical criteria of having ADHD, especially for, an AFAB femi person, just felt a little empowering because then there was just some context around why certain things happened the way that they did and why my brain does kind of flow in the ways that it does.
mm,
And in some ways I just think, especially with the word belonging, I think it gives a little bit more context around, there really is no, if belonging is tied to this idea of feeling safe and connected with a group of people or a concept of a group of people,
mm-hmm,
then the way that my brain and emotions and just sense of self has always existed in the world didn't really wasn't conducive to that sense of safety and feeling in a group. And I didn't necessarily need a word to kind of justify it, but I also have, chronic illness that had for almost 2 decades never had any real language for it except like it's in your head. And so there is
mm,
some kind of sense of like you get to kind of breathe a little or exhale a little when someone is like, oh no, it's a thing and here's the word for it. And
mm.
then when there was
Yeah.
opportunity to explore medication that was non-stimulant to support what I was going through or what I was experiencing, just to kind of reduce some of the erratic symptoms that were definitely hijacking chunks of my day. That
Mm,
felt exciting to me and scary as well. But, everything I guess at
mm.
this point is scary. It just kind of felt like maybe
Yeah.
this could actually give me a sense of enough of a sense of grounding so that there wasn't as much sort of chaotic ping pong match stuff going on the inside, and maybe that would offer a little bit of like a sense of safety that has nothing to do with actual danger outside of myself, but just being able to feel safe in my skin suit ultimately.
Mm.
And
Wow. Yeah.
so I think there's definitely connections, like spiderweb connections, but I wouldn't
Mhm.
necessarily put a total through line
Mhm.
between, queerness, ADHD, and belonging. But there's
Mhm.
certainly an umbrella somewhere where they hang out together underneath.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah, you just mentioned something about language, and what you said was you don't really, you're not really all that attached to language maybe, or you haven't got language that totally feels right, and you said that sometimes the terms agender, non-binary and demigirl kind of work. Yeah, so where do they fit in? What do you like about those labels?
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because I think there's probably an element of still like lingering feelings of I'm not enough of XYZ in order to really fully use XYZ word. But I don't really know, like the whole agender word, I don't actually know if I have no connection to gender because I
Mhm.
have some kind of connections, and I don't know if it's purely from really intense socialization. I had emotionally masculine socialization, and then in terms of like physical, it was very feminine
Mhm.
girl, soon to be woman, all of that shit. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't know if like agender actually makes any sense for that. But then I also
Mm.
like the idea that there is just a detachment, which I do at this point very much feel like a detachment from
Mm.
core sense of self and really just noticing what I have picked up along the way and what I've
Mhm.
just my learned behaviors or just learned things, not things that are necessarily innate to me.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
similar with non-binary, I mean that I think makes potentially the most sense just because I really don't have a place along that imaginary line in between. I mean, that's not even really a thing anyway, but like the idea of there being
Mm.
two options or like 60-40 or 70-30, you know, in between that definitely doesn't make any sense for
Yeah.
me. And it kind of does feel a similar sense of, I don't know if, again, like that word safety keeps coming up, but similar with the word queer, like it could really mean different things to different people, but it communicates a general idea that like I really don't exist in that space. So that's why that word feels good. And I always love the idea of demigirl, in part because I love when I work with queer and trans teenagers, and when I very rarely encounter someone who's like, oh, I'm a demigirl, I'm like, oh, hey, you know, and good for
Yeah.
you. And I love that you have the internet, because you that's it for sure where you picked that up. And I wish that I had the internet, you know, millions of years ago when I was your age. But there's a sense of that, like, you know, demi is a fun word because it's kind of like sort of there, sort of not, adjacent but not, you know, it's like non-committal and
Yeah.
like non-permanent, I guess. And the idea of there of being a demigirl, at least it feels at times like, yeah, I can definitely relate to that, because there's the lingering bits that maybe aren't as performative and are just kind of like a part of my sense of self, depending on, I guess, the day, or sometimes even just like the time of year or time of the month.
Yeah.
And then also the idea, you know, I like the idea of there being preservation of ideas like femme, feminine, girl, but like redefined and self-defined, very much like just rejecting the baggage that's been imposed on those words, ultimately
Yeah.
not by women and feminine people, though definitely perpetuated by them. And I
Yeah.
like to just kind of use those words again as a bit of a reframe and a rejection of all of just so much, you know, harm and sadness and just stuff that those words can carry for so many people. Because I don't, by no means do I want there to be any kind of erasure of words as a result of you know, or at least gender, you know, gender words, because there's that I don't think is a solution either. And I think that if
Yeah.
on an individual sense, if we have a relationship to those words and can understand them outside of what, you know, has been imposed on them as their definitions at their core, then that can also feel really healing, and I think also bring maybe a sense of belonging that is just a different kind of belonging that maybe we aren't as used to.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting. I mean, talking about the word femme, I was just thinking about the word woman. What does the word woman mean to you? You know, whether you relate to it or not, or however much, you know? Because I'm,
Yeah,
I'm
I mean,
currently wondering
totally.
about that myself. It's like, what does it even mean to me anymore? It's like the more I
Mhm.
learn about gender, because obviously you said you work with young people, like trans and gender diverse young people, which is amazing. And I've been doing this podcast for a while now, so like, you know, it's different ways of learning about the subject and the people and how their experience is. So like, yeah, so I'm questioning, like, what does it mean to me to be a woman? And like, kind of like
Mhm.
yourself, I guess, I feel like it's an ongoing journey of discovery. So I feel like, I guess I can define that for myself, and I don't know how attached I am to it. So yeah, I
Mhm.
wondered what it means to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because in, you know, US politics right now, the idea of like what is a woman is literally
Mm,
questions being put forth to future
yeah.
Supreme Court justices, as though it's this big thing. I see it as a
Mm,
noun. I also see it as an adjective, and I see it as a word created and invented by white dudes to try to define like core genetic innate differences between the, you know, the idea of there being two categories of people in order to justify gender roles and expectations and limitations and just oppression
yeah.
of anybody who ultimately, you know, has a vulva or a presumed uterus or whatever else might be going on with them.
Mm,
And so it means a lot of different things. But I guess for me, I noticed about a year and a half ago when I was either on another podcast or I was maybe brought on as like a guest teacher for something. I can't even remember, but someone
mm,
said that oh gosh, like that I was a strong woman. And I remember just feeling, ugh, like, ugh, it was just didn't feel right at all. And it wasn't even like
yeah.
ew, don't call me that. It was just woman. I don't know. It just really did not feel, it didn't feel good and it didn't feel right. And it almost felt like, are you
Mm.
even like, are you looking at me right now? Like, have you had conversations with me? It's just it was
Mm.
a very interesting experience to have had. And so it just told me very clearly that a word that I very much used to feel connected to, in part because it felt like I had won and beat the system around, see, I am a woman now because look what I have been able to do, and look what I've been able to, conform to and force my body to look a certain way as,
Mm.
and look at
Mhm.
all of the, approval and affirmation I'm getting from these men I don't even think are appealing or attractive to me. And
Yeah.
so it just like really my core, there was no real connection there. And once there was a real understanding of like how not only has the word yes been politicized, but also used
Mhm.
as, I don't know, like weaponized by
Yeah.
cisgender women as like this exclusive club yet again. And
Mm.
it just reminded me so much of this idea of the exclusive club when I was in elementary school, middle school, and high school, and even part of college, where I was just so desperately like, please let me sit at that lunch table. I'll do anything. I will starve myself. I will make my immune system go down to zero. I will obsessively
Mm.
exercise at 4 in the morning before I go to classes just so that I can show you how committed I am to this, and
Mhm.
then I get like crumbs in return. It was really
Yeah.
just like, oh, this is a fucking garbage club that a lot of these women don't even realize that they are maintaining and upholding.
Yep.
And then just want to just run around wearing like pink pussy hats, like that's the only concern on the planet. And so for me,
Mm.
I that word of course has all these things associated, but at the end of the day, it really is a made up word, just like every other word. Girl, when the girl was first made up as a word, like it was not used to describe young future women. It was just any kid was called a girl.
Mm.
So when you really get into like words and semantics, and I am a word nerd, you realize how much unearned, unreasonable power so many of these words have been given by people in power in order to maintain that power. Then it just takes all the air out of the balloon. And it's just like, oh, this is literally just a word, just like chair, just like dinosaur. Like it doesn't, there's no hierarchy here. And I really get to decide
Mm.
if it fucking matters. And if it doesn't, great. And if it
Mhm.
does, also great. But if it does matter to me, I'm also going to understand that there comes some responsibility with it.
Mhm.
And part of that responsibility is to really think about how I use the word, how I connect with others around that word, and to be intentional around, am I in any moment inadvertently or advertently perpetuating any kind of harm toward others in any kind of sense of that exclusive club? And if I am,
Mhm.
interrogate that very quickly. And if I don't currently have like therapists on hand to really have conversations with,
Mhm.
ideally a queer therapist, even a trans therapist, and pay them extra, because it's just like that's the real work
Mm.
to be done in order to truly
Yeah.
understand what these words mean to us and what we're and why,
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. God, that makes so much sense. I've just realized as well, like the more you awaken to all this stuff and the patriarchal toxic masculinity stuff, and the more you see how we're conditioned, and that we are upholding it and we're perpetuating it as well. Like we're in that and we're like not even aware of it or conscious of it most of the time. Oh,
Yeah,
it's a minefield, isn't it, really?
for sure. I mean, it's
Yeah.
definitely, I joke about I've seen behind so many curtains that it's easy to kind of just label me as like the killjoy who, don't invite me to the party, and and then I'm like jaded about the
Wow.
world. And I think some days I would totally call myself that, but in an empowered
Hmm.
sense. But it's just really understanding how much of stuff is not just made up, because most things are, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's made up with a
Hmm.
certain intention behind it, like a nefarious intent. And
Mm.
how desperately folks with any sense of power in any kind of way cling to that, to the point where they are willing to kill people over it, to
Mm.
maintain that like meaning over language. It really is just like, oh wow, yeah, like nothing matters and everything matters, okay. And it really forces you to live life in a very different way. And it
Mm.
can mean you might go on anxiety meds, or you might like need to take
Mm.
melatonin or sleeping pills at night some days, because it can
Mm.
feel really tough to reconcile with, especially your own
Mhm.
responsibility in it. But also at the
Yeah.
same time, it's kind of like I wouldn't want it any other way, because the other option is to be really just disconnected from reality.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, like, ignorance is bliss, right? As he
Kinda.
says in The Matrix when he bites into a steak.
Yeah, and I think there's
Yeah.
something valid to that. Like
Yeah,
there's
there
certainly
is.
bliss to that,
Yep.
because then you get to just like
Mhm.
focus on, I don't know, how wonderful things are, and the sort of the construct around what's going on, so that it's easier to swallow.
Yep.
And for some folks, like that is literally necessary to survive. So at the end of the day, like I say all this without even necessarily any judgment, but like if it's if it's how it needs to be forever and ever, and there is no space for any other kind of experiencing reality, like that's where I think there's space to explore and think about it.
Mhm.
But there's also, certain folks who are just like, fuck that, I've experienced too fucking much, and I need to just focus on, the butterflies and the sunshine. And it's like,
Mm.
okay, you know?
Totally. Yeah, I find there's a lot of grief in that process as well. Like, as
Oh my
you
God.
it's not
Yeah.
all like, yeah, unicorns and rainbows, is it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I realize, I think that I mean, constant mourning. And I think that I've had
Mm.
all kinds of interrupted, incomplete grief or experiences that I think I would ultimately be labeled as grief
Mhm.
or grieving. And so absolutely. I mean, it's a lot of this is they're different forms of death. A sense of
Mm.
reality is maybe a sense of self, a sense of connection, a sense of community. There's all kinds of little deaths as part of this process.
Mm.
And there is nothing wrong with feeling fucking sad about that,
Right.
because it's all
Mm.
it's all a form of loss. And
Yeah,
I just try to
totally.
frame it as, and it might sound kind of twee, but like I frame it as a garden where it's just weeding. And sometimes there
Mhm.
are plants that they're beautiful, but they're taking over. And so you have to remove them, even if they're gorgeous.
Mhm.
And then for a while, your garden might look like this chaotic mess, and maybe like with big vacant gaps. And it's like, this is ugly. What the hell did I do?
Mhm.
But it just means that there's space for something, either something else to grow because it has space to be there, or you
Mm.
get to go to the fucking plant store, and you're just like,
Yeah.
what's going to be less invasive and what makes more sense, and what do I get to choose to be in this garden today based on what works for me, not
Mm.
what was always there. And then you get to take that home and nurture it on your terms. And then at some point, you're not even going to necessarily notice, but you'll walk outside one day and you're like, oh fuck, the garden looks good. When did that
Mm.
happen? So I just try
Yeah.
to think of it as that, and
Yeah.
take, again, really think about like, is there in any moment a disproportionate amount of meaning that I may be putting on this that could be just making it harder for myself? And is it
Mhm.
possible to let any of that go? And sometimes the answer is no, but then other times it's, yeah, probably. Let's just see what that's like. And then figure out, like, in the process, what self-soothing do I need? That might mean
Mm.
like, yeah, I might get high a couple days. Maybe I'll eat more ice cream, or
Yeah.
I might fuck off work a little bit. But
Oh, yeah.
or I might not get out of bed until like 9, or it's
Yeah.
just like I just try to meet myself where I'm at, even though I will potentially judge it at the same time, just
Mhm.
because like anything that will make it possible to continue moving forward with it is valid and
Mm.
valiant even.
Yeah, totally. I love what you just said about self-soothing. That is
Mhm.
such a big thing because it's like they're just skills we often don't learn, when we're growing up because our parents
Yeah.
didn't have them, So I feel like I'm now learning all these things that I feel like I can get a bit judgmental on myself about because I'm like, these are basic skills and I just don't know them. Do you know what I mean? But
Mhm.
there you go. So be it. You've got to accept that and think, well, I'm learning them now, you know?
Well,
Yeah.
totally. And I think,
Yeah.
in the meantime, we're all doing some form of self-soothing, even if maybe it's not the kind a therapist would recommend. And so
Mm.
sometimes that self-soothing can show up as or appear like self-sabotage, or it can look like mental
Yes.
illness, or it can look like, something slightly obsessive. And I
Yeah.
also just kind of feel like, if you don't have access to the kind of self-soothing that maybe people tweet about, then you're still actually taking care of yourself and figuring out how to continue living each day. It might not look great on
Yeah.
paper, and it might be causing other issues that you have to address, but you're doing it, because without it, you might kill yourself, literally.
Yeah,
It's
that
really
is so
just,
true. It's all
yeah, it's
self-preservation, right? Yeah.
totally. I
And
mean,
keeping
everything
again back to the
from
safety.
Mhm.
Yeah, being safe and keeping
Absolutely,
you safe.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I look at my fingernails right now, my cuticles. Like,
Mm.
my mother used to do this as well, but like I scratch at or pick at or sometimes bite my cuticles out of
Mm.
anxiety without even noticing. But
Mm.
like, and that's certainly not something a therapist would prescribe that I do in order to maintain. And I even,
Mm.
some of the anxiety has been so intense. I have little tiny chips in my bottom front teeth just from the constant biting down.
Wow,
So
yeah.
it's just an example of like, I am by no means saying this is great and causes no problems,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's a thing. And I
Yeah.
graduated from biting my nails down till they bled when I was a kid to just biting my cuticles sometimes. So that's
Mm.
something to celebrate. And, at the end of the
Yeah.
day, like, that's something that my body and my brain work together on to try to work through something, regardless of what kinds of, meds I might have access to. And
Mhm.
that's self-soothing,
That
same
makes
with,
so much sense, yeah. Because
yeah,
I
totally.
do that myself, to be honest. I used to bite my nails when I was a kid and the skin around my nails, but
Mhm,
also, like, even now, I do pick at them, not as much as
mhm.
I used to, but on a smaller scale, but there is something, like, yeah, soothing about it for some reason. Yeah. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I
Mhm.
think anything that we do that gives us a sense of like control or order, even though technically we're
Yeah.
probably just creating new chaos, is something that is
Yeah.
genuinely a self-soothing or self-preservation, I need to access control in an uncontrollable place
Yeah.
type of thing. And so
Mhm.
it gives context, because nothing is ever all or nothing. Everything is
Mhm.
just kind of
Mhm.
always in the in between. And so
Yeah.
same deal with self-soothing. Everything can cause issues if we are connecting or relating to it in a way that, I don't know, is, whether it's overdoing it, or I don't even know what to call it. But it's just
Mm.
like taking the judgment and the meaning away from it to be able to just like notice that it exists,
Mm.
and make space for like, is there anything else I could do, or what could I do if and when I notice I'm doing the thing, so that I can just prevent it from getting to that point where it's making my teeth chip, or or my finger bleed.
Mhm.
And that, I just think, is the kind of like compassion and kindness that ideally we would be able to have for one another when we're out in the world, or on a fucking plane, or at the grocery
Mhm.
store. But we often can't. And so what we can ultimately control is, how can we like access that and bring that into our own internal world, so we can experience it somewhere.
Mhm.
And that can be a really I don't know, it's just a lovely experience, because it proves to you that it's possible. And then you can kind of explore what it would be like to introduce some of that in your own world, but specifically you showing it to others. And that can be sort of like a
Mhm.
next level in finding a sense of a different kind of control and a different kind of safety. And I really do believe that there is
Mhm.
some kind of butterfly effect around, or ripple effect around,
Mhm.
showing that kind of kindness and compassion to the mail person, or the person who helped you bag your groceries or whatever. And
Mm.
that changes them, at least for in a moment in that day. And that also may open space for them to experience it for themselves internally, or pay it forward to someone else. I
Mhm.
really do think that that is possible.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like the more, like, self-compassion and self-acceptance I cultivate, the more I have that for other people as well.
Hmm.
And it's like, it's not even a matter of where to start. It's like a chicken or the egg, really. You can start anywhere, like being in service and acts of kindness and stuff can make us feel better about ourselves. And I'm sure apply that to ourselves as well. So for me, I almost feel like it works together, it always goes hand in hand in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Mm. Yeah. So in your work, what specifically would you say you've learned about gender, from your work with gender diverse folks?
That I mean, because I mostly work with people in inpatient settings who have experienced incredible amounts of like total harm as a result of
Mm.
them just kind of being who they are.
Right.
What I really have learned about gender is that it really just is a tool of control and oppression, and maintaining some sense of social order that just
Mm.
ultimately serves a small group of people. Maybe not so much small, but like a certain group. And
Yeah.
that it's very much this ethereal, what's the intangible thing you can't hold, which makes it very hard for some people to grasp and understand and respect, and for other people to grasp for themselves, because it's just like this sort of floaty concept, filled with emotions and ideas. And so in some ways that can feel very stressful and chaotic, because like I can't measure it and I can't hold it, and what do you mean it's different for everyone? Like that's terrifying to me. I like to flip that on its
Mm.
head and try to reframe around, well, if it's so intangible and individual and subjective and full of feeling and ideas, and that's it, what power does it ultimately have?
Mm.
It's like air almost. And for some
Mm.
people, and obviously that like analogy can get thrown in the ground and stomped on, but it's just like at that moment, it really doesn't have that much power, or it has as much power as you want to give it, which means everything from, using it to kind of control other people, decide who other people are and who they can't be, as well as for yourself, what it means to you and how you control yourself and what it means and doesn't mean to you. And so I really
Mm.
just, as I see not just people's difficulty, usually cisgender people's difficulty having these conversations, but just constantly being exposed to individual examples of life-changing detrimental harm as a result of these really restrictive binary ideas of gender. It just it makes me angrier and angrier about the
Mhm.
idea of how it's been weaponized, and then
Yeah.
really makes it even more clear about what it is and what it's not,
Mhm.
which then can make it a lot easier for me to have conversations about it with people of any identity, because I've it's like I've seen the wizard behind the curtain 4 million times, and not only is the wizard tiny and unremarkable, but like he's also a little mouse, like it's just sort of, oh, this is the
Yeah.
thing, cool, then like I really know
Mm.
how to navigate this, for myself and other people, whether they're angry at me for having the conversation or whether they're so excited to talk to me about it because no one else will.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. I was just thinking where to take it next. I was thinking about your book. You wrote a book called Speaking from the Heart 18 Languages for Modern Love, which is like an evolution, if you will, I guess, on the
Mhm.
5 love languages that many people know about. What made you want to write about it?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a connection
Yeah.
there with what we were just talking about,
Yeah.
because the idea of a love language I've always really appreciated, because it takes an intangible and gives it a little bit more tangibility for people to kind of better understand what it can mean to them, as
Mm-hmm.
well as the reality that it might not actually mean the same to other people. But of course, the original 5 had all kinds of limitations, including the fact that it's, made a white Christian minister with no marriage or relationship counseling experience outside of ministry, who
Yep.
also is openly and publicly homophobic, made him a millionaire,
Mm.
and continues to, by very intentionally keeping his ideas not a total secret, but like it's just secret enough so it's harder for people to actually know what's real about this
Mm-hmm.
person.
Yeah.
So when I would use the concept of love languages in my groups with adults and kids, I would always have to do this first, initial preamble about, now I'm going to create a new container or a different lens to look at this through, and here's why. I felt that was just genuinely responsible, and also transparency is a really important part that's missing from a lot of just general education experiences.
Mm.
So I would have to rewrite it, reframe it, sort of reconceptualize it in order to be able to safely use it with people.
Mm-hmm.
And after a while, it's exhausting to do that. But then I realized, I'm not the only person in my community who has to do that every time they would teach about the love languages. So I had this thought, I could take the years of whatever my little preambles were and make like a pamphlet or just some sort of, a love language reframe so that it could be like a teaching tool. And so we wouldn't have to kind of keep figuring it out on our own, how to reframe and rephrase things and reconceptualize it. And so I had that idea for years and just, had this little, among many Word documents of just certain ideas and things that would slowly crystallize over time. And it got to a point at, I guess, early 2021 where I'm not sure exactly what really like lit the final match under me, but it just fully formed all of a sudden. And I just went into the Word document and was just started writing some of these other thoughts down. And it soon became way more than a pamphlet and really was just like, these are the actual concepts or the actions or the ways I would describe certain feelings of love and being loved. And really wanted to not just offer the love language reframe, because yes, that's important, but I realized I also really wanted to offer a complete reframe of the concept of a relationship and a total reframe of the concept of love outside of sex and touch and earning and reciprocity even. Because those were the things that were also coming up in all these groups that I would be doing. And I'm realizing like, oh, all of this needs to be included here. This keeps coming up, month after month, group after group over years and years and years. It's a thing. It's definitely not unique to just a couple of conversations. And a lot of that also meant having to break down really hard, deep-rooted ideas about what love is and what touch is and what a relationship is and isn't, and these sort of hierarchical ideas that are again totally invented and yet just imposed on everybody as though that's what they always have been, which
like
really just
gender
keeps
roles, right?
us
Yeah.
gender roles, toxic monogamy, heteronormative, anything, because anyone of any gender can experience and perpetuate heteronormativity, just like anyone of any gender can perpetuate patriarchy. And so it was really just like, we might not actually even realize that some of the things that we feel are important or we're really trying to cling to and maintain with our partners or in our lives are the very things that have been designed and invented to maintain a system we're not actually even connected to and have no respect for. And so what if we were able to really look around and notice all of the little walls that we are encased in, and we might not even know they're there because they're like plexiglass. We can see through them, so sometimes we don't know it's there until we smack up against it. And so it was really just like, what are the things I'm noticing that I and my clients keep smacking up against, and how are they related to these messages we get about love and touch and respect and relationships and all the things. And so ultimately the result was what that ebook is now, which is just a non-exhaustive, list of 18 concepts of love or conceptions of love that I was able to identify. There's, I'm sure, millions, and really wanting to just like not write a 300-page deep dive because we've got enough of that. And it doesn't apply to everybody. I can't go do deep dives in books anymore after the last couple of years. Like my brain can't do it. So I'm just like, how do I take these ideas and these concepts that are important and like put them on a page in a way that can be digestible and doesn't require a 6-month reading commitment and can be easily shared with people of a variety of learning abilities and ages and cognitive abilities, and just try to get these concepts through. So that's what the ebook is now. And I'm sure it's going to sort of develop and expand into something with like, a workbook component and some things that I know people really enjoy doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been really it's been out for the 1-year anniversary was actually April 2nd.
Nice.
So it's been really interesting to see how it's
Yeah.
been received.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Nice. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading it actually. It's very digestible, it's very bite-sized, isn't it? And I really resonated with some of the the specificity of some of them. It just goes deeper than the original kind of, 5, I suppose. And one of the things that really stood out for me was the emotional labor part, because I
Mhm.
feel like the way I was raised and socialized and brought up, I feel like that is such a thing that is expected of, I don't know, I guess women, I
Mhm.
suppose. It so is. And I feel like I've gotten to a stage where I'm like, I'm almost a bit done with it, because
Mhm.
it's so, and I think it's so taken for granted as well, as,
Yeah.
yeah, wow. Yeah, so that one really stood out for me. And I also loved what you talked about, if you don't mind me talking about some of these,
Sure.
a bit of a taster. Yeah, like the one where you talk about platonic touch, because,
Mhm.
even a lot of touch is like, I don't know, there's so much, what's the word? Like, I think touch is something we all need, but we are taught that it's only if you're in an intimate, romantic sexual relationship, then, all touch goes. But like in other relationships, it's almost like, no, that's not okay. You can't do that. This is not
Mhm.
acceptable. And I feel like that's what we just need that. Like we need so much more of it. And we should, consensually, obviously. But I feel like we should all be just free to like hug our friends or kiss our friend, whatever we feel like doing, and really break these, again, like quite binary rules of. I guess it's toxic monogamy, isn't it? What you just said.
It's a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this idea of our partner is an object that we own on our terms and we will
Mhm.
not share and cannot share because heaven forbid, and
Yeah.
which
And
is
they have to meet
ultimately.
all our needs, all the stuff.
Oh,
Yeah.
totally. I mean, in
Yeah.
some ways it's kind of like capitalism and commodity like brought into human relationship, in addition to
Mm.
the whole monogamy shit. It's
Yeah.
just like, I mean, we all have really complicated relationships to touch in general for all kinds of very important valid reasons. And
Mhm.
and it is true there are a lot of folks who actually do not have that same need for touch like
Mhm.
others, including certain, neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
So there's either like this idea that touch is essential, therefore we need to touch each other and I should have access to you just like you should have access to me.
Mhm.
Or it's the other extreme, which is like I get to decide who you touch based on what makes me uncomfortable or comfortable. And
Yeah.
also, I need to have full access to you because I have chosen you. You have agreed to be my spouse or partner or whatever in this monogamy. And therefore,
Mm.
that is some sort of blanket entitlement and
Mm.
access,
Yeah.
permission.
Right.
And then when in the in between, it's just like we have such a sort of scrambled education about what touch is and is not. So a lot of folks, touch is just sexualized no matter what,
Mhm.
often because of, not always, but caregivers or people in our lives would weaponize touch as a way like this, I'm doing this because I love you. This is what love is. So we end up
Mm.
conflating love, sex, and touch as though they're all synonyms.
Mhm.
And then it can get really confusing and complicated when we are trying to navigate relationships, whether they're platonic or romantic or sexual, because we're not really sure what each thing means, or we are really
Mm.
sure, but what they mean to us isn't actually what they mean to everyone else in our lives because we got a very specific kind of education about them. And
Mm.
so it's really just like there's just so many different relationships to the idea of touch. And then we're all trying to relate to one another as though we're all on the same page, but we're actually
Mm.
not. And we rarely even know because we don't
Yeah.
like have these conversations over coffee necessarily. And
Yeah.
so it's really just understanding that, yeah, this idea of relationship hierarchy and what we expect of our partners and what are we closed off to because of made up rules, and is that leaving all of us not only just starved for the kind of connection or love or respect expression that we need, but we're also putting incredible amounts of pressure and responsibility on our partners and
Mhm.
vice versa.
Yeah.
And is that contributing to our sense of exhaustion and our total compassion fatigue and feeling like our needs can never get met? Because if we
Mm.
are really making one person outside of ourselves responsible for meeting all our needs, like, fuck yeah, your needs are not going to get met and you're going to feel resentful
Right?
all the time.
Yeah. It's such a tricky subject. I almost feel like learning more about gender, it's just opened this can of worms, and then all of a sudden you see all this stuff, like how we do relationships, how we do gender roles, and like not even I mean, the people I've been speaking to have been mostly, for the podcast, have been mostly like non-binary, if you will, gender
Mhm.
identities in some form or another, although some trans people obviously have a very binary transition.
Mhm.
But like as soon as you start to see like the binaries in that, like the real like yeses and nos, like this is acceptable, this is not, this is good, this is bad, once you start
Mhm.
seeing that, you kind of start seeing it in everything, don't you? And
Oh,
it
yeah.
just, yeah, yeah. God, it's so
Yeah.
insightful.
I mean, that's a big part of that too. Binary is just fucking everywhere outside of gender. Win or
Yep.
loser, right or wrong, good
Hmm.
or bad. We talk about like good emotions or bad emotions. You're either happy or you're sad. It's like fucking
Hmm.
everywhere. And it's such a scam. And you're just like, oh my God, this is total hot garbage. How do I get out of here? And like, what can I do to break out of this? Because it definitely sucks for everyone
Yep.
in different ways. And I
Hmm.
can't do anything about that, but I can certainly do something about my own participation to it and connection to it. And it's definitely, yeah, once you start noticing it in one place, you start really being able to notice it everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah. I was wondering if there is anything you would like to add that we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, geez. I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, there's so much to say. But I think, yeah, I think that we've really touched on some core stuff. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
definitely like, as you can see, like I live in the murky parts of these topics. Like I'm really like
Mm.
don't know how to have like surface level conversations about stuff like this anymore.
Mm.
So there's always more to kind of like mine into, but I think that, this conversation has gone pretty well and not too deep into the depths.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a
Is
very interesting one, isn't it? Like, as a lot of people, I think, are worried to explore,
Mhm.
like call it the shadow, call it, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
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 Well,
But it
yeah,
is
I
so
mean
important. Mm.
that's like the good vibes only culture, which is also a whole thing
Toxic
that
spirituality and bypassing,
absolutely
right? Yeah.
bypassing all of that, all of that. It's really again just all made up to try to give people a false sense of safety and comfort
Mm.
and it's all yeah, it's all garbage. And I think
Yeah.
that to at least even validate some of the discomfort around exploring. I mean, I'm speaking specifically, as someone who lives in the United States, it
Hmm.
is threatening. It
Hmm.
really is actually like scary to explore this stuff, especially if anybody ends up finding out about it, because you never really know how people feel
Yeah.
until they're confronted by it. And you start to get a bit of a rude awakening around, oh my God, that's how
Hmm.
you feel about this? Holy, oh my God. Okay. What do I do now? And so it really
Mm.
isn't safe in a lot of places to explore this, especially now and especially as someone under
Mm.
the age of 18. And
Hmm.
so I just want to like affirm that and validate any fear because it really
Yeah.
can risk so much.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, we really do get to decide our own risk management, our own cost
Hmm.
benefit analysis,
Yeah.
if you will, for making these kinds of explorations. And what I'd like to remind people at least is that, to exploring doesn't mean anything has to be permanent. It doesn't mean anything even has to be public. And it
Hmm.
also doesn't mean anything has to even be physically visible to other
Yeah.
people. And so
Right.
exploration can absolutely start internal and it can build in your own room or your home or wherever you might live where there's any kind of privacy and that's valid, and there's no
Mm.
you don't have to do anything at a certain level for it to count, or to be
Hmm.
official. And
Yeah.
and sometimes, for a lot of people, they think that or the messaging around this idea of transition means like some sort of 180 flip,
Mm.
which
Yeah.
again is binary stuff, right? You're either
Yeah.
transition from this or the other, right? And you can, I mean, transition means whatever it means to you, including like a transition in language or even just, social. You change your hair color or your cut, you try
Mhm.
different clothes and different, maybe a different name or other kinds of language. And like, that's valid too. There's no,
Mhm.
there's no like, oh, what's that word? Like there's a completion bar, like when you're completing a quiz or something and you're 30% through,
Mhm.
30, like there is no
Yeah.
100%,
Yeah.
so you get to just really like do the exploration on your terms as well as everything else, even if maybe other people around you can get kind of vocal about their own opinions of whether it's complete or not, other people's opinions about your experience and your transition and your exploration. Technically, it's none of your business, but also literally meaningless. They have no fucking idea. They are not the experts of you.
Mm.
You're the expert of you, and everyone else can just kind of fuck off, ultimately.
Put that on a t-shirt. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. God, absolutely. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing, Anne.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me on.
You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Anne, which is ANNE, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Anne on their websites, Hodder-Shipp.com and everyonedeservessexed.com, and on Instagram. Links are on the episode page. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media, and on YouTube. Again, if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded.